First of all, just a few words about the history of the relationship between business and corporate history and archives and oral history. And I have to say, I don't think it's a relationship which has always been terribly happy, at least not until relatively recently. As part of a piece of work I did a few years ago, I did a survey of the use of oral history by business historians and the existence of oral history in business archives, particularly in the UK, but also in Europe more generally. And I was really surprised to find that relatively few business historians have actually extensively used oral history and personal accounts in their corporate histories. And those that have don't quote directly from them often. They don't always know what they've done with the recordings. Not all of them are tape recorded. Some of them were written down. And in many cases, they use a supplementary information to provide additional information to the paper records, rather than really seeing oral history as something in its own right that can provide a different kind of information. And I think that's still the case if I look around business histories around the UK. It's still not really been embedded within everyday practice by business historians. Equally, on the other hand, I think it's true of oral historians themselves, and I probably would be guilty of this in my younger years, to really consider oral history as something that's radical, that it's ideologically averse to working with business and corporate history generally. Oral history, as many of you know, in its radical origins in the 1960s and 70s, was really seen as a methodology of the marginalised and the dispossessed. And I think it was generally felt by the oral history movement that business and the activity of business wouldn't fit into any of those categories about powerlessness or oppression or dispossession. So I think we have, as oral historians, a traditional difficulty and discomfort of working with particular groups. And that's our problem as oral historians, I think. And I think what this has led to is very little active engagement between the two communities, between oral historians on the one hand and between business historians and archivists on the other hand. But things are changing, and over the last 10 years I've seen very significant change, a lot more engagement between the two communities, a lot more open use by business historians of oral history, and as we've heard during today, increasing amounts of oral history activity going on in projects around and companies around the world. We've heard already this afternoon about Cipla. We heard earlier about Rothschild and Evernick, all of them recognising the value of oral history. And I think one of the things that obviously is notable is the pace of change of adopting oral history as a technique by companies. Particular different paces of change between Europe and the UK and the US. A lot more active engagement with oral history as a company technique in the US, as we're going to hear tomorrow, I think. Little quick something about what we've been doing, and really my credentials for standing in front of you saying anything about this topic is that at National Life Stories at the British Library, we've carried out over the last 30 years a whole series of corporate and business activities. Some of these have been commissioned directly by companies, in the case of Tesco, for instance, and Wolf Olins, which is a branding consultancy. Some of them we initiated ourselves. Some of them are smaller projects, some of them large. And I think this has led to a whole series of different outputs. Obviously, my aim and intention is to generate long life story interviews. And one of the discussion points we could perhaps come back to later is exactly what we mean by oral history, because I think it's something that isn't terribly well problematized by business historians who've made use of oral history. And a lot of the things I've heard today, I wouldn't necessarily sign up to play that we would do oral history, because we're very wedded to the long life story approach. So the average length of interviews in all the projects you see in front of you would be 12 hours, in which the corporate and the business experience is embedded within the wider life story, and therefore the social context that gives you. And we found that a very fruitful way of operating. Mainly audio, but increasingly using some video. So the image you see at the bottom right there is a computer pioneer standing in front of his computer that he invented in the 1950s. So we make a benefit and a real virtue of the visual when we are going to use visual, but otherwise we do long, in-depth audio interviews. Now, let me just quickly highlight some of the things I think we've already heard today. So I'm going to summarise these quite quickly, but also come on to talk a bit about the challenges, because we've heard a lot about the benefits, but I think we've heard slightly less about the challenges, and that will lead into my two colleagues and what they're going to say. So we've heard, haven't we, the way in which oral history can give us more history. Oral history of businesses can give us the everyday, the disappearing practices, the relationships within the workplace, the hierarchies, what happens at a senior level and how that plays out lower down. Many of these reflections, as we all know, absent from the documentary record. Hidden voices, we've heard earlier about women's voices, but also junior staff. Still far too many oral history projects about businesses draw on senior staff, board members, and I'd like to see a lot more oral history really from the bottom up as much as from the top down, but certainly a cross-section of the business. Discordant voices. One of the most difficult things, I think, for particularly in-house oral history projects within companies to engage with is people who disagree with the company view, people who are sacked from the company, people who left the company, and the idea that you might interview consumers and customers as well as people who work within the company to give different views, I think is important. Oral history, as we know, can feed into myth and story around organisations. We can hear more about that later. And of course, the rich texture of the atmosphere of the workplace and relationships within it, and the way in which technology is impacted on those workplaces is a way in which oral history really can surface a lot of those particular issues. And finally, I suppose, the bit that a lot of people forget is what happens when people go home. So oral history, at its best, I think, about business history, should be looking at the work-life balance. What's the contribution of the family to the individual that was employed? Now, as a bottom line, oral history, I think, can be a very important tool, as we've also heard, for gathering knowledge, which, to use Arnold Kransdorff's resonant phrase, walks out the door when the employee leaves. So there's a lot of companies that have used techniques like exit interviews, but very few of them have then extended exit interviews into something more considered and more reflective about the whole life course or career course of the business. And I think there's real opportunities here, not only to use the oral history technique to gather vital information that will be lost, but also to get broader context and reflection on the business. We've also used it in a number of our projects around change management. So in the project we did on Royal Mail, that was undergoing major change and a real threat to the public ethos of the company. The company were able to use the sense of public duty very firmly imbued within the company and use the oral history to support those values at a time of change within the company. Equally, in a project we did on the North Sea, and you see an interview here with a very rare female person who worked in the oil industry. She was a cleaner on the rig that you see a model of in front of her there. We were able to interview people involved in a quite infamous disaster in the North Sea, the Piper Alpha oil rig disaster, where a large number of people were killed. And the interviews that we did with the survivors are now used in health and safety education within the industry. So you can directly feed the oral history experiences back into the business, to use that phrase, looping it back into the business. And finally, of course, brand building. I don't need to say anything about that because we've been talking about that all day, and you're going to hear more about that in a second. But finally, let me turn briefly to the challenges, and I hope you keep some of these things in your mind for the discussion afterwards, because these are things that I've encountered as issues for oral history practice within business history. The first question being, of course, should oral history as practice be carried out internally or externally? Is it better for an oral history project to be from within the firm, or do you outsource it and commission people like me to come in and do it? And obviously I would argue that it's better to be an external activity, because I think external expertise provides an arm's length sense of proportion. So you're not having a lot of the internal dialogues, which I think are a risk with internal staff and so on, and often puts them in a very difficult position. The practical challenges of doing this sort of work, work you'll be very familiar with, but most importantly, there is a difference, I think, which is very important for us as archivists to get a sense of, and we've heard a lot about this already today, which is the difference between what you archive and what you make available. Obviously, when you're interviewing people correctly and in full, you're going to be gathering a lot of confidential and sensitive information. And the question for you, obviously, always as an archivist, is how do you handle that? How do you embargo and safely keep material so that it recognises people's right to privacy and confidentiality? And the question I would want to ask, of course, is it in fact possible to do an oral history project from inside the company that really gets to grips with the challenges, the failures, the things that the company feels slightly embarrassed about, and once you've gathered that material, what do you do with it as the internal archivist? So the shared and divergent objectives here around the archive and then the product, what derives from the archive that you can make publicly available and or use in outward-facing audiences. And allied to that, of course, is self-censorship. How do you encourage someone in an interview situation to really depart from the corporate line and begin to talk honestly about their experiences and reflections? And I think that remains a challenge for all of us who do this sort of work.